Hi, I just want to introduce Brian Heuser, who is from Vanderbilt University. Brian is an assistant professor and is the director of the International Leadership Development Track in his department. And Brian also is one of these interesting individuals that sort of bridges the divide between academics and policy, and he is also a U.S. Embassy policy specialist in the Republic of Georgia. So he brings a very interesting perspective today, and he will be moderating the next session. Go to that one. Joe, can you turn?
It should be on.
Just push the button. We got it. All right.
Great. Thank you so much. I am truly honored to be here. Bob, Tom, Jason, and Taya. Taya was one of our finest master's students in the history, short history, 10-year history of our international ed policy and management program, and we're thrilled she's here, and I am honored to be here as well. Since Bob said we should embrace stories, I'd like to start with one of my own and give you a little bit of context for where I'm at right now in my own work, and I think one of the reasons I was asked to be here. A funny thing happened a few years ago at Vanderbilt. In particular, I'm at the Peabody School of Ed and Human Development. We became somewhat ascendant in the rankings. Those of us who live and die by them, we love to criticize them, but when you end up being ranked number one in the country 3 years in a row, it has a specific effect, which is both good and bad. First of all, you say, how actually did we get here? Did we game it, or did we earn it? And the second thing that happens is a certain level of international prestige. And one of the things that happened was that international partners came coming and calling. And one of those, and one of the ones that were most interested in partnering with at this point is the government of Abu Dhabi, something that's interesting to Jason and the colleagues at SUNY. And Abu Dhabi came to us with a very interesting invite, which was to, one, set up a branch campus of Peabody, and two, it was to essentially rework the entire education system of the country, which, as you can imagine, is no small undertaking. But the point being is that this produced a number of other effects, which was that some of us became very interested in what do these arrangements look like practically. And then I found myself in Jordan because I was asking these questions and they were asking me to build elements of this into my own curriculum, both at the undergrad and at the master's level, right? So I find myself in Jordan where I then happened to run into or be introduced to a wonderful man that some of you may know him by the name of Jawad Anani, the former prime minister, deputy prime minister of Jordan, who also happened to be a Vanderbilt alum. And we talked extensively about his time in Nashville, and then also his time at University of Georgia. He did his BA in economics at Vanderbilt, and then went on to do his PhD at University of Georgia. And being in the Southeast, we talked a lot about his acculturation. Right, we talked a lot then about what he took back to Jordan in the form of skills and knowledge and sensitivities and sensibilities. And in the midst of this conversation and others that were going on, I began to etch out a framework for how I wanted to introduce this panel today, which is to say, first, and honoring many of the comments that have come before and trying to pretend many of the comments that are going to shortly occur. It seems as though this topic of higher education, international relations, and particularly this panel on public diplomacy needs to do a few things. And we need to do a few things as both scholars and practitioners, okay? And I am both. I'm full-time faculty, but I'm also a practitioner. The first is I think that we have to begin to differentiate between traditional diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, traditional public diplomacy, and these emergent forms of higher education diplomacy. The comment was also made earlier, what do we mean now by international education? And I would say, what do we mean now by international higher education? It's fairly easy to come up with a comprehensive list of its activities, but it's far harder, I think, to gain a comprehensive picture of its overall directions and the implications. In my classes, I have begun to refer to this in economic terms, Amartya Sen terms. I've started calling this capabilities diplomacy, right? Because it just seems like these traditional notions don't fully capture what's actually happening. Programs such as Muskie that I work on, Fulbright, Humphreys and Boren, but also training more broadly of foreign nationals and also U.S. students abroad. The training that happens and connected to curriculum, right? In global health even. The development of capabilities of more or less average citizens, right, both abroad and here, who then increase the capabilities or the capacities of their own organizations and institutions, right? And I think understanding how that training impacts these organizations and environments, which in my experience, are, and again anecdotally, are often shaped profoundly through these programs. But also, how does the acquisition of human capital and these individuals' acculturation in higher education institutions then shape the macro structures on up? My second, or actually my third point would be that, and I have a degree in comparative ethics and theology, my first grad degree, and so I think an awful lot about the values that are embedded in higher education institutions, right? The values of private institutions that were once religious, the values of public institutions that perhaps were land grant or had a primary focus on serving regional interests, the values of faculty, the values of administrators, whether we love them or not, and the values also of the academic profession. And one of the great contrasts here for me, particularly in the realm of my work in Georgia, which has mostly been to investigate the viability of research and development in higher ed institutions in the Republic of Georgia, are the academic values of research and development, and whether or not those are affecting larger structures as more and more participants enter. Finally, and this has come up numerous times, but just for the sake of reiterating it, I think one of the most important things that can come out of this profound work, and Bob, I thank you so much because I really honestly believe that this is profound work, that we're breaking new ground here, would be the measurement of some of these outputs, right? The measurement of not only what is international higher ed, but measurements of, well, what are new forms of public diplomacy? What is, use my phrase again, how would we measure capabilities diplomacy, right? So without further ado, let me turn it over to our distinguished panel, and Ilgud Osler will start us off. So, okay. Do you want that one or you want this one?
I'll take this one.
Okay.
Is it working? Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm new to this. I'm a political scientist by training. I'm new to this in the research realm, but I am not new to this in experience realm. I'm a child of exchange. I have been permanently exchanged to the United States from Turkey. I was a Rotary exchange student in high school, and that was it. And I'm still here 24 years later. And I am a child of public schools, University of Wisconsin, UCLA, and now I contribute to SUNY. So I do believe in public education. And here, as we consider internationalized higher education, I must emphasize that I see internationalized higher education as the core of public diplomacy. I'm sorry I'm contradicting some of the morning session, I guess. But before trying to understand the impact of international education on international relations, I was thinking that we should first consider the types of programs that fit this definition. And here I'm trying to bring in what I know. My goal is to describe the various types of curricular practices in international education that I have been involved in, the hope is to later develop further studies in assessing the role of internationalized education as public diplomacy and how these experiences impact international relations directly and indirectly. So let me first review what we know about this, what the literature tells us about public diplomacy and international relations. The U.S. government defines the goals of public diplomacy as advancing national interest, enhancing national security by informing and influencing foreign publics, and strengthening the relations of U.S. with the rest of the world. So thus public diplomacy aims to build soft power in the United States, of the United States. But if you look at this from a global perspective, and I see myself as a global citizen that looks at things from a global perspective, the goal of public diplomacy is to create a more stable and peaceful world. So this happens through a positive change in public attitudes toward what is foreign, what is different, and in developing greater mutual understanding among different nations, not just from the perspective of the U.S., but from the perspective of all the different campuses from around the world that are practicing the same kind of public diplomacy. The goals of public diplomacy can be achieved through a multilateral context within the context of the United Nations or other intergovernmental organizations, and in bilateral settings. Universities are present in multilateral and bilateral contexts. And this can take place through social, economic, and political discourse. So if we accept the notion that norms and beliefs and understandings of elites matter in shaping international relations, then we can also accept the fact that national interest is a social construction, and it develops through interaction of social discourse amongst state elites. And this points to a tremendous power of public diplomacy. And I would argue that international higher education institutions are at the core of this social discourse that occurs. And putting aside, and this is what the constructivist theorists have argued, and it's not just soft, loosey-goosey arguments. Constructivists in international relations have actually empirically demonstrated over and over that actually norms, beliefs, and attitudes change over time, and national interest changes over time. But putting aside constructivism, liberal theorists in international relations, using, again, rigorous empirical studies, have demonstrated 3 variables matter for a peaceful and stable world. And these 3 variables are economic development, number 1, and interdependence between states, trade interdependence between states, democratic politics, and participation in intergovernmental organizations. These 3 variables lead to a more peaceful and stable world. And higher education institutions educate democratic citizens with a strong propensity to enhance all these 3 variables, I would argue. Therefore, I'm proposing this argument that an internationalized curriculum, which is at the heart of public diplomacy, is key to the development and enhancement of foreign policies that lead to a more stable and peaceful world. Call me naive, but that's okay. In order to understand internationalized higher education as public diplomacy, we need to pay attention to national level policy processes, as we discussed some of those this morning. But here I want to focus more on the micro level processes, the internationalized curriculums that students get exposed to. And we know little about how student experiences in internationalized education impact them as practitioners of international relations later. And in order to study this question and address some of the gaps in knowledge, we would have to go beyond the typical program assessment that have been done in public diplomacy programs, and we would need to seek to identify the connections between the academic practice of international education and its economic, social, and political consequences for international relations later on. So I suggest this line of research can start by defining international education at SUNY campuses, what I practice and what we practice here. And here I'm going to pay attention to those programs that give students some kind of experiential learning. And I'm making a great assumption here that experiential internationalized curriculum is the most intense form of exposure to public diplomacy. So let's look at these programs. The first set of programs that I want to discuss are the kinds of programs that take students away from their home country into other countries, like the Fulbright Hays that we were talking about this morning, that takes academics out of the country but I'm talking about the exchange programs. What types of experiences do students gain from these? Exchange programs are programs that provide students with direct experience in living and taking courses in other countries. They are for a limited amount of time. Students tend to develop language skills, communication skills, and a rich cultural understanding of the country that they're visiting. And students, especially, we have to differentiate between those students that do in-home stays in the exchange programs, where they get a deeper understanding of the country that they're visiting, and those students that kind of stay in the international dorm and they hang out with their buddies and have a good time. So there is a difference in experience. But regardless, the exchange students gain exposure to a foreign culture and do so for a greater period of time than, let's say, students who do study tours of a country, for example. And these types of study tours, a second type of program that takes students away from their home country, are shorter in term, but they are more focused in specific areas. It can be arts, culture, music, politics. But these kinds of programs actually give students a very intense, focused study of a specific area, but limited in time and focus, as I said. A third kind of program that we have at SUNY system is the dual diploma programs. And those are the kinds of programs that I think give the students the most comprehensive cultural experience. Because students in these programs are exposed to full curriculums in both home country and the country that they're going to as a foreign student. They get 2 diplomas with a single degree, fulfilling the requirements of both institutions, which means that the students are culturally involved, they have longer time study, they have mastered the language skills that are necessary to succeed in another country, and they also have full range of general education requirements fulfilled in both countries. And I must say that general education requirement fulfillment in both countries is a very key to understanding the country's history, culture, and what is expected of a citizen in that country in liberal arts education. Second, we have domestic courses with an internationalized experiential component. As we speak, my class is being taught at SUNY New Paltz right now. It is a Turkish-American relations class that I'm teaching with a colleague from Şehir University in Turkey, and he's teaching my students right now using technology. And this is a collaborative online international learning initiative by SUNY, run out of SUNY Global Center. And faculty and students collaborate using best available and most appropriate technology to create cross collaborations. And this is very different in experience than a lone exchange student sitting and giving his or her opinion in a classroom setting, where students equally represented in 2 classroom settings can actually exchange ideas and opinions in collaborative online learning initiative. So this kind of program is very promising, and for those of us who are talking about technology today, you know, this is a form of use of technology that enables the types of discourse that I was trying to talk about earlier. Among the other types of programs that are taught here at SUNY are the Model Organization of American States, Model European Union, Model United Nations. These are the simulation classes that take the students out of a classroom setting and gives them the role of another country's personality. The students are supposed to take their American shoes off, or whatever country they are from, those shoes off, and step into the shoes of a diplomat from another country. And these types of programs are helpful in allowing students to relate to the relative positions of other countries. So when they later on become practitioners themselves, they have to assess their own interest in relation to cost to the others. And this enables them to be able to do that. Other domestic models for international education include fieldwork classes. We had an example this morning. The picture book was from that kind of experience that I'm talking about, where it involves internships in international organizations, and these allow students to develop an internationalized perspectives. Intergovernmental organizations and internationalized non-governmental organizations tend to approach issues such as development, human rights, and peace from a global common perspective, and allowing students to have a global common perspective. And these are the kinds of courses that give students an advantage in understanding the world better. And there are also hybrid courses that expose students to the study of international relations by site visits. The United Nations has long maintained a unit dedicated to public lectures for schools and other organizations, and students gain knowledge of the work of multilateral institutions, developing an appreciation for cooperation and mutual agreements, as well as power relations in the international system. These different types of programs through which curriculums have been internationalized help students learn and grow in ways that are valuable to them, and indirectly for others with whom that they come into contact with. And this is especially important for students who ultimately obtain roles whereby they can influence international relations, or even for any active citizen who are politically engaged. So by assessing this kind of effect and how much of an effect such program can have, we can make a great impact. But this is very difficult. One of the many challenges in undertaking the development of such a measure is that students are engaged in a wide range of educational pursuits, not just these types of internationalized programs. And in some of these cases where students are directly studying in international relations, it may be easier to measure changes in their outlook or specific policy position following an internationalized curricular experience. But the career choices of these students may also reflect their experience in international programs. In cases where the students are studying arts, culture, social and economic issues, history, the impact and the connection to international relations may be more difficult to establish. So we have to differentiate among those programs with curricular content in international politics and other programs in such areas. So to sum it up, public diplomacy through internationalized education can improve ties between nations, and this is a hypothesis that we really should seek to study. And we can sort through the complicating factors through careful design of studies. And here I'm providing an overview of the internationalized curricular experiences, almost like an independent variable here, right, at SUNY institutions, and some of the strengths and weaknesses associated with these programs. But for future research, we should consider designing studies that can assess the foreign policy beliefs and outlooks, career trajectories, and life choices made by those students who have had internationalized educational experiences relative to those students who have not had those internationalized educational influences. So here, this is a very minor proposal in perhaps one study, but nevertheless, I hope it would be valuable to do so. I'll stop it.
Thank you. I'm reminded, please. I'm reminded how far along in the process of developing international programs, particularly those with robust academics, some institutions are, and I'm a bit envious. Stephen Dunnett was unable to be with us due to illness, but John J. Wood is graciously filling in, and we're thrilled to have him, so please.
I'll come up here if you don't mind.
You want this mic or that?
Oh, this will work, won't it? Maybe not. There you go. Thank you very much, and good morning. Well, apologies to Brian and our distinguished panelists. I'm filling in for Stephen, who's the Vice Provost for International Education at the University of Buffalo. He fell ill yesterday and regrets that he couldn't join you this morning. Very much regrets missing this opportunity to take part in the proceedings and share in the discussion with you. It's a topic very close to his heart, one that has been of central importance to him through a long and distinguished career as an international educator. He had prepared remarks and of very personal nature, reflecting on that long experience of his, and I thought it only appropriate that I speak for him rather than try to speak to my own experience, although I hope to have an opportunity as we enter the discussion phase to address some of my own observations. I have had the privilege of working with Stephen for a number of years, and I'm familiar with a number of the programs and initiatives that he talks about in this reflection. And so I certainly can vouch for the cogencies of these anecdotes, and will share or benefit from his experience and insight. So I shall proceed here in his voice, as it were. I will speak about the role of U.S. institutions of higher education as active and indeed essential players in U.S. public diplomacy. I'll illustrate my talk, as Ilgo was doing, with some examples drawn from my institution, the University of Buffalo, and in particular, and from the State University of New York in general. In summary, U.S. institutions of higher education have long played an important role in U.S. public diplomacy, and they have been, I think, valuable players in the following ways. They welcome and educate international students and visiting scholars. They send their students and faculty overseas to study or to teach or engage in international exchange and development. They participate in U.S. government overseas development assistance programs sponsored by USAID and other programs. They participate in U.S. government-supported exchange programs such as Fulbright by either receiving and partially supporting Fulbright scholars and Fulbright students on their campuses, or by encouraging their own students and faculty to participate in Fulbright exchange programs overseas. They engage in many kinds of collaborative activities with partner institutions abroad, whether it be through traditional exchange agreements or by developing branch campuses overseas, or by engaging in newer forms of cooperation, dual and joint degree programs with overseas institutions, for example, or by offering their degree programs overseas in various modes of delivery, such as live in-country instruction, distance learning, or various forms of hybrid delivery involving blended learning. They maintain authentic dialogue with counterpart institutions in countries where U.S. diplomatic relations may not exist or where they are viewed with suspicion. Let me speak in more detail about these various ways in which American universities and colleges have played their role in U.S. public diplomacy. Let's start with our students. It could be said that in the late 19th century, when the U.S. land-grant colleges and universities enrolled their first international students from, among other places, Mexico, Central America, and Canada, and when they welcomed German and British academics to teach in their colleges, they began to play this role. But it was not until after the Second World War that U.S. universities really became major players in public diplomacy. American academics were very active in the Reconstruction projects in Europe, and especially Japan, from 1946 onward. In the late 1950s, U.S. universities and colleges began to welcome large numbers of international students from Europe, Africa, and Latin America, and a little later from Japan and the rest of Asia. Today, the United States is the largest recipient of students from other countries, and in 2011, it welcomed some 725,000 international students. Now, that this impressive number represents a shrinking U.S. market share of international students worldwide not only reflects the increased competition for international students, but also the fact that U.S. higher education can no longer be seen as the default destination for international students. It might also be said that with escalating costs in the United States, there may be a narrowing of the eligible pool of international students, among them affluent students from Asia. When Stephen, that is, gives speeches in the local community about the value of international education, I often argue that international students help us internationalize our own local U.S. student body by virtue of their presence on our campus, and the fact that they will return to their home countries with a greater appreciation of the United States and of its values, institutions, and way of life. This is the so-called winning of hearts and minds strategy. I also argue that cultural contact helps us to diminish stereotypes and break down the barriers which divide us. In short, we are contributing to mutual understanding and ultimately to world peace. If these arguments don't resonate, I point out that 5,000 international students enrolled at the University of Buffalo contribute over $100 million annually to the economy of Western New York. And I contrast this with the fact that the Buffalo Bills brought in only around $80 million to our local economy. That usually gets the attention of our business community. Of course, our state and federal governments encourage us to welcome international students. Typically, students pay 2 to 3 times the resident tuition rate, which is certainly helpful during these difficult economic times. But I believe the federal government's motivation to encourage institutions of higher education to recruit international students is more about what many of the panelists have said, soft power, than about improving our trade imbalance. However, I should add that we have not really empirically tested the popular belief that international students leave our country with a positive image of the United States and its foreign policy. To know us is not always to love us. And as we know, there are enough infamous examples of the contrary, including, you may recall, figures like Syed Qutb, the leading ideologue during the formative years of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, who studied here for several years in the late 1940s and came away with a very poor, albeit very warped opinion of American civilization and values, one that influenced many later Islamist extremists. When I, that is Stephen, had to meet with Muslim students on our campus recently to try to explain the activities of the New York City Police Department on our campus, I did not feel those students were going to go home believing that civil liberties were well protected in the United States. But to come back to the main point, I believe it is incumbent on U.S. academics to conduct more research on the experience and attitudes of the international students we educate here. Certainly from my own observations over the 40-some years of my career, that's Stephen's career, I haven't been around that long, in international education, I'm convinced the majority of the students who study on our campuses do return home with positive feelings about that experience and about the country. My chief regret is that the impact international students make on Americans and on the host culture seems to be much less than the impact we have on them. In addition to welcoming international students to our universities and colleges, we also send out approximately, at latest count, 270,000 American students to engage in study, research, work, or service abroad programs. Now, this may sound like a big number, and it's certainly a large increase over a decade ago. But regrettably, the national participation rate in study abroad amounts to only about 2% of our undergraduate students. And the majority of these undertake programs of 2 months or less. These young Americans, however, like Peace Corps volunteers, can be our best ambassadors. And I think this is a point that's been made already. It is frequently said that study abroad is a life-changing experience, and indeed it is for many of these participants. But in many cases, these students also change the lives of the persons and perspectives, I would say, of the persons that they interact with overseas. And these students from the United States who study abroad also present a more positive image of our country to those whom they meet. So do our faculty who work on USAID projects in developing countries around the world, or those who venture overseas as Fulbrighters, or who teach and do research in exchange partner universities abroad. I once heard someone say that if the U.S. Department of State can be said to have a brand around the world, it is the Fulbright program. Many years ago, I was a Fulbright scholar in Japan. I had previously spent time in Japan and in Asia, and I did not expect the Fulbright experience would affect me very much at the time, since at the time I felt I knew and understood Japanese culture quite well. However, I had never worked in Japan, and once I was immersed in my host university, I slowly began to realize I didn't know Japan or Japanese nearly as well as I had previously thought. To work side by side with Japanese colleagues, to engage in the life of my host academic department, to have long and continuous contact with my students, taught me things and gave me insights I would never have gained otherwise. And looking back on that experience, I'd like to think I might have touched the lives of my colleagues and students a little, that I might have given something back, certainly not the same degree as I had received, but perhaps some measure of positive influence on my hosts. I mentioned earlier that U.S. faculty members engage in a great variety of overseas development activities. I was privileged to work in China when the University of Buffalo established the first U.S. University Training Center in Beijing, not long after normalization of diplomatic relations. Later, I participated in U.S. development projects in management education in Latvia, Poland, and Hungary in the early 1990s, working with a number of Sunni colleagues. And I can say with much pride that we did indeed make a difference in the lives of the people we served in those countries. Did we make friends for America? Without a doubt. As noted, U.S. institutions engage in many different kinds of collaboration activities with partner institutions abroad. And indeed, the variety of models for this engagement has never been as diverse as it is today. While the traditional exchange agreements between institutions of higher education are still the mainstay of our collaboration overseas, new forms of cooperation are rapidly developing, such as offshore degree programs, branch campuses overseas, and the like. Stony Brook University, for example, is about to open a branch campus in Korea. The University at Buffalo, another example, has a rapidly growing branch campus in Singapore, which currently enrolls more than 1,500 students. My university also offers graduate degree programs in China and India with prestigious local partners, and we teach English at centers in Taiwan and Japan. Increasingly, we're working with European institutions through university networks, such as the Coimbra Group, where we're partnering on 2 current projects that are funded by the European Commission. Increasingly popular models for international institutional cooperation are dual and joint degree programs. SUNY can take much credit in having developed the first system-wide undergraduate dual diploma program that Doguz already described with some of the leading institutions of higher education in Turkey. This goes back to the early years of the first decade of the century. Under this model, there are, I think, at the present time, at least 2,000 Turkish students studying in 24 dual diploma programs at 10 SUNY colleges and universities. The architect of this nationally recognized and award-winning program, Ambassador Gassendi, who's with us today, deserves our gratitude not only for conceptualizing the innovative DDP model, which is now widely adopted both in the U.S. and overseas, but also for building it into a fully operational and highly successful program with many hundreds of graduates to its credit so far. It's one thing to have a great model, but to make it work, that's the true difference. Bob, you can be very proud of this legacy, and on behalf of my own institution, I thank you very much. Without question, the hundreds of students from Turkey who study in SUNY classrooms every semester contribute to a deeper understanding between Americans and Turks. And when those students return to Turkey, a critical U.S. ally and a friend in a difficult and strategically vital part of the world, they will undoubtedly become effective ambassadors for the United States to their own people. Since the time grows short, I would like to mention one more important way in which U.S. universities contribute to our nation's public diplomacy, even when our government doesn't always welcome or support us in that role. We maintain authentic dialogue with our counterpart institutions of higher education in countries where Washington may no longer maintain diplomatic relations or where official channels of communication are disrupted or broken. I'm thinking of the role U.S. universities played during the Cold War era in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, or in Vietnam and Cambodia after the U.S. withdrawal from Southeast Asia. For example, I was privileged to be a member of several U.S. academic reconciliation delegations to both Vietnam and Cambodia before diplomatic relations were restored. A more contemporary example concerns our current troubled and complex relationship with Cuba. Despite the many barriers erected by the U.S. Treasury Department over the years, several universities have persevered in maintaining exchange programs and study abroad programs in Cuba, including both SUNY Oswego and the University at Buffalo. The University of Buffalo maintains an active exchange program at the University of Havana, and indeed we continue to collaborate on a master's degree program in Caribbean Studies. I wish you could sit in classrooms or with faculty groups with me and listen, indeed participate in the intensive discussions we have with our counterparts from Havana, discussing issues relating to our bilateral relationship, or simply chatting about our families and way of life. This is true citizen diplomacy. In concluding, let me say that when my colleagues and I are doing the work we love in international education, I don't believe we stop to think of ourselves as advancing U.S. public diplomacy objectives. Indeed, it was only a few years ago, when there was a different administration in Washington, some of us would have been appalled by such a thought. We're just doing what we have been trained to do as academics, as teachers, and as internationalists. If we do step back and reflect on the role we play in U.S. public diplomacy, I think we can take some measure of pride in knowing that we contribute to a greater and more positive understanding of our country and its values. I only wish our government would spend a little more time, a little more in the way of resources on supporting our activities and in supporting exchange programs such as Fulbright. When I look at the activities of other countries in this domain currently, and just to cite one example, China with its Confucius Institutes around the world, including 5 here in SUNY so far, I regret the loss of USIA and of the information centers and libraries we once proudly provided overseas. I regret the loss of the scholarship programs we once offered to African students who can no longer afford to study in our country. Our embassies are now armed fortresses which do not welcome the very citizens we hope to engage. And while I understand the reasons for this situation, I don't understand why we can't also have off-site informational and educational centers to assist us in the vital work of public diplomacy. But this may be a discussion for another session. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. It's my southern naivete. I keep thinking that it's only in the South that we have to defend our educational programs against professional sports, but apparently that's a universal as well. Michael McCary, please.
Surely not Vanderbilt.
No, not at Vanderbilt.
Whoa, that's not going to work. How did you do that? So I'll just put that there, and with my soggy notes, try to continue. I'm a bit of an outlier here. I'm not based on a campus. I work for a group called the Alliance for International Educational and Cultural Exchange, and many of you may not know the Alliance. We're based in D.C. We're an association of about 75 NGOs that do all kinds of exchange programs. And really what we do is advocate on behalf of the exchange community, which in essence makes me a lobbyist for exchange programs. We don't do contributions, or we don't have a PAC, so I'm a lobbyist in the sense that Congress requires me to register every quarter, so I'm on the list and we have to say what bills we're working on and so forth. I am a retired foreign service officer, and after my first assignment, 3 wonderful years in Thailand, in its wisdom, the U.S. Information Agency assigned me to the Office of African Affairs, a continent I've never visited and knew very little about beyond, high school social studies. And I immediately, of course, wound up working for Bob Gassendi, which in the first couple of weeks, I'll have to say, is an experience I would characterize as bracing. But once I got the feel for the metabolism of the office, I learned an awful lot, and I think you can probably draw a straight line between that assignment and my presence here today. I want to talk about politics and funding, or for the atmosphere around these programs today. That it came up in very interesting ways in the first panel, and I wanted to add to that. Most of what I work on is State Department exchange funding, because that's what our members care most about. I cooperate closely with the higher ed associations who promote Title VI funding. There's a separate coalition for international education that does a remarkable job of advocating for that, and I'll talk a little bit about that and what I see as the differences, because I think the funding picture is very different. First off, the Obama request for State Department exchanges this year was actually a decrease. It was 1.8% decrease. Now, in the context of where we are in terms of federal funding, a 1.8% cut can feel like a win. State exchange funding has been flat for a couple of years, but there is really, for these programs, and in State Department exchanges, I'm talking about Fulbright, educational advising, Gilman scholarships, Humphrey, Muskie, a variety of high school, youth, and citizen exchanges and professional exchanges. There's been remarkable bipartisan support for those programs over the past decade, starting really this almost renaissance, you could call it, in exchange program funding started with in the aftermath of 9/11, as you might imagine. From FY03 to FY10, the State Department exchange budget increased from $243 million to $635 million, more than doubled. And that, if I brought a slide with that graph, you'd see that really started in the second Bush term, has continued in the Obama term, and regardless of the party in the White House or the party in control of Congress, the upward slope is pretty consistent. State Department exchange programs have lots of supporters, lots of friends, and no enemies, except right now, the scarcity of funding. That's the bad news. There's a lot of support, a lot of understanding about why this stuff matters, and the great work that is done on campuses through Fulbright and other exchanges. There's just no more money. And so we've had flat funding for the last 2 years, a slight cut from that high water mark of 635 down to 598. That's what we're hoping to get again this year. I think that'll be an uphill battle. But it's been, these have been very popular programs. In a month after the 9/11 attacks, October 11, 2001, there was a hearing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Henry Hyde was the chair at that time. It was called the International Relations Committee. And that hearing was really, I can't recall the title, but it was really, I think of it as the Why Do They Hate Us hearing. And Henry Hyde, who had a long career in Congress and was most famous for things other than foreign affairs, but he became the chairman of international relations. And he asked that question. He said, we're the nation of Madison Avenue. We can sell Uncle Ben's rice to Thailand. Actually, I don't think we can, but that was, he said, we can sell something to anybody. And why is it that everybody hates us? Why haven't we been able to sell ourselves? And that was the question that hung over the hearing. And the Alliance testified, I'm actually quite proud of this, the Alliance testified that what we really needed to do was have what we called an Islamic exchange initiative. We needed to we'd never had a foreign policy crisis that had been so deeply rooted in cultural misunderstanding. The natural student flows from that part of the world were not particularly high for many parts of that world. And we needed to do more, and we needed to do it quickly to get engaged in a deeper and broader way with the Muslim world, not just in the Middle East, but across the whole expanse. And we had some impact there. And one of the reasons I'm proud of it is I think we were the first people to say it. You'll recall at that time that most of the discussion was about how high can we build a fence around the United States? How difficult can we make it to get a visa to the United States? One of the other things we worked on at the same time, the other main issue, was trying to keep the visa policy, the visa power, and the visa issuing authority in the State Department and away from Homeland Security. Think about that for a minute if you want to wake up in the middle of the night screaming. So, I'll come back a little bit to the Islamic stuff in a minute. But so my point is, we've had a great run of support. I think that support is still there. Mark mentioned in his comments this morning the failure of the Simon legislation. I would say that happened not because people didn't support the concept or didn't support exchanges. It's one of those pogo moments where we were the enemy. The exchange international ed community, in my view at least, the problem was that the community couldn't get together on what format it wanted the program to be in. And so one segment wanted there to be a separate foundation, in essence setting up a new government entity to run a single program. Others felt it could go into the State Department. Congress was ready to do the State Department piece, but not the foundation piece, and we couldn't get everybody around that, so that failed. But it was us. It was on us. It wasn't really that Congress didn't like the idea. I think quite the contrary. The point was made earlier in the first panel about how do things change. The Cold War, we're fighting Cold War and communism, and now we're fighting terrorism. Well, I think the focus of the programs changes, but I would say that if you look at the history of exchange funding, it tends to go up when there's a foreign policy crisis. Everybody likes the idea of exchange, but if you're just talking about if you're talking about a peaceful world, or at least a world without a major crisis, something that, like the breakup of the Soviet Union or the 9/11 attacks, you don't get those big funding increases. You get big funding increases when there's a sense that we have to respond to a problem, and these programs are ways to do it. And they're ways to do it in sensitive situations. It's not an accident that when the U.S., when countries are, not just the U.S., but when countries where there have been difficult relationships are trying to improve those relationships, exchanges are often the first place they go. Let's do some low-level stuff. Let's get some student exchanges going. Let's send a ping pong team. Let's do something that builds some comedy and shows some common interest that everybody can get, in ways that everybody can get behind. The question came up about data. I think, we need more stories and we need better data, but we have more data, and these things are more measurable than we think. I'm sure Rick is going to talk about this afternoon, but State Department has won awards over the last decade for the studies it's done of its own programs that show the impact of these programs. And here's where I circle back to Islamic exchanges. When we were promoting the Islamic Exchange Initiative, Senator Kennedy, we had a policy paper that was circulating around. Senator Kennedy's foreign policy person called me up and said, "Can you get a group of people to come in and talk to me about this? We're kind of interested in a high school exchange program for Muslims, but we don't know how to do it." So I assembled the group, and we dutifully went in, and we had another bracing chat about 3 hours. And the thing that, and in the end, we got a program. And the thing that clinched it was data. State Department had been running, this was Senator Bradley's brainchild. After the Soviet Union broke up, there was a lot of money that went into exchanges for that part of the world because there were no civic culture. People needed to be exposed to our values. People need to understand how to work with the developed nations and take their place in the Western world. And young people were a place to start. And so a program called Future Leaders Exchange, FLEX, was set up and fairly generously funded. And we had a long number of years of FLEX data. USIA did a study of FLEX students, attitudinal study, and measured program alumni's attitudes as compared to their counterparts in the same age cohort, same countries, their attitudes on things like a free press, aspirations toward leadership, attitude toward foreign trade, their view on the importance of free elections. And lo and behold, the FLEX kids were off the charts compared to others in their age cohort who had not had the American experience. And when I gave that study to Senator Kennedy's staff, that clinched the deal. This is exactly what we want. And within 6 months, Kennedy was an extremely skilled legislator, had an extremely skilled staff. Within 6 months, we had money for a program that continues today very successfully. Shifting over to the Title VI stuff, Mark has it exactly right. The funding cuts have been devastating, and part of that, I think, is that one of the people, an assistant provost at a major university, I'll leave his name out of it, told me a few years ago that I hadn't quite realized because I don't work on this one full time. He said that never has an administration, Republican or Democrat, proposed a significant funding increase for the Title VI programs, for the critical language and area studies things. And all the increases that have come through the activity of this Coalition for International Education and through the presence until recently of David Obey on the Appropriations Committee. David Obey from Wisconsin, Democrat who chaired the committee, was senior on the committee for years and then chaired it, had studied Russian and understood the importance of these Title VI things. Individuals can matter. And when Obey retired, that lack of commitment, I think, on both sides really caused the programs to suffer. And having had a few meetings with both the Coalition and even at the Department of Ed, it's hard to be optimistic about where that's headed with the, it's interesting that the international ed programs on the State Department side have done pretty well, education side not well at all. And it's a very difficult time for the Coalition for those programs. I just want to close with a couple of, since we're talking about the role of universities in public diplomacy, I just want to make a couple of points based on my foreign service experience. My last overseas assignment, I was very fortunate. I was a cultural attaché in Beijing in the immediate post-Tiananmen Square period. So I arrived 3 weeks after Tiananmen Square on July 1, 1989. And the cultural attaché is in charge of all the official exchange programs, one of which, of course, was Fulbright. And many of you probably recall that the Chinese, it took about a month after I arrived to get a meeting with the Chinese to discuss next year's Fulbright program, which after all, I arrived July 1, and late August, Fulbrighters are going to start arriving, American Fulbright professors. It took about a month to get that meeting, so around about August 1st, the Chinese inform us in very unpleasant terms that the Fulbright program will be suspended. There will be no Fulbright program. Because the Chinese, for a whole lot of reasons, but the Chinese were very concerned at that time, about what they called spiritual pollution. All those students were in the square. All those students built this statue that looked a lot like the Statue of Liberty. All those, universities were closed, and from a Chinese point of view, official Chinese point of view, chaos ensued because of spiritual pollution, because of Western values. So the Fulbright program was out. Around that time, a guy named, the first Bush was president, George H.W. Bush, who of course had his own China experience, and a guy named Bruce Gelb was the director of USIA, and he testified at a congressional hearing, probably defending his budget. And this was about the time when things with the shakeup had started in Eastern Europe. And he was asked a question about the impact of the IV program. I believe it was in Romania. And the director of USIA said, as you might expect him to say, in a situation where he's defending his budget and his programs, that something to the order of, I won't get this exactly right, but you'll get the idea, something on the order of, nobody who comes to the United States as an international visitor on this program, they're invited by the embassy to come and spend 3 weeks with their professional counterparts, and visit American families and so forth. No one who comes in this program will be unaffected. The Chinese noticed that sentence. And that was pretty much the end of it. That confirmed their decision to end official exchanges for about a year. So, because what was the director of USA talking about, if not spiritual pollution? That was my job. I felt very subversive the whole time I was in China. It was really, kind of liberating for a foreign service officer. But while that was going on, while they were shutting down official programs, and here's my point about the role of universities, other things were allowed to happen. The Chinese allowed other things to take place. CIE was sending American study abroad students to Peking University, and they were allowed to continue. They're not big numbers in those days, but they were allowed to continue. Most dramatically, the Hopkins Nanjing Center, which probably most of you are familiar with, was allowed to continue. It was still relatively new, fairly fragile. It was very much there's a building, some of you probably visited, there's a building on the Nanjing University campus. It's one of the best universities in China. It's entirely a cooperative enterprise. There are two directors, two co-directors, an American and a Chinese. For those who aren't familiar, the student body is half and half, the faculty is half and half. Chinese kids roomed with American kids as long as the math and the gender worked out. The American kids took classes from Chinese professors in Chinese. The Chinese kids from American professors in English. And they had a library, probably the freest, most interesting library, though it was small in China at that time, at least it was open to people of student age who weren't high-level cadres. Hopkins had its problems at that time. There were particular problems about some periodicals and newspapers being shown to students in the U.S., and we got involved in that at the embassy a little bit, but we didn't have many cards to play on that particular issue in the short term. But the fact is, the Chinese allowed Hopkins, my point is, the Chinese allowed Hopkins Nanjing to continue. And it's because they saw value in it. It's because universities have, the word was used, I think Dan used the word at the end of the last panel, credibility. Things can happen sometimes. This is China post-Tiananmen, I understand, is a very extreme situation, a very extreme example. But in places where things are difficult, universities have opportunities to do things that the U.S. government does not. And it doesn't mean that the university has to be taking on, the mantle of American foreign policy. I don't think that's required at all. But if you believe, we've had several definitions of public diplomacy, and what I think I'm working for is just building up a web of contacts between the U.S. and other countries that support positive bilateral relationships without talking about particular outcomes. I think that's what universities can really do, what they have done, and I'm sure will continue to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. We got time for a few questions.
Brian, I just wanted to to pick up on one story, because sometimes the stories are relevant background as to what went on. The president, in my experience, there were three, in my lifetime, three really powerful U.S. presidents, college presidents, university presidents, who really supported international education. One of them was Ernest Boyer, who was chancellor here at the State University of New York 30 years ago. Another was Stephen Miller, who was president at Johns Hopkins. The third is John Ryan, former chancellor here, president at Indiana University. But Stephen Miller got in his head that SAIS should replicate in Nanjing the center they had had so much success with in Bologna after World War II. And so he found the money to found the Nanjing Center. And for that, he got fired because the medical school was furious that he took that money and wasted it off on founding the Nanjing Center. This is a true fact story. They wanted another MRI. Now, why do I tell that tale? This is a fragile business we're in. You know, that's literally true. That was the thing that got Stephen Miller ousted as president of SAIS. That center is still going. It's been every bit as successful as their center in Bologna. And as Michael indicates, you know, it was able to continue even with the Tiananmen Square fiasco. Dan Levy.
Thank you for the introduction. My question is mostly rhetorical, but I'm wondering whether a university-based conference on this sort of subject matter inevitably has a certain political bent to it. And I don't mean that the political bent is egregious or uniform, but I'll give a few examples of what I think passes as pretty much givens here, and I don't think would pass as givens in some other venues. And although these are just examples, I can't think of strong counterexamples. And this isn't to say that I'm for these things or not, but the impacts of the programs are mostly good. Where we have good activities, they should get government funding. If they have government funding, they generally should have more government funding. We make comparisons to China beating us out. This sounds to me exactly like the green energy debate. If government has to do something because their governments are doing it, that might be a good debate, that might be a good argument in the end, but I don't think it should be taken as a given. We have a different threshold historically in the United States about what good things ought to be done by government. Exchange programs with Cuba, you might like them, but you might not. Appalled to serve U.S. government public diplomacy under Bush, of course. A goal of having common global views, that's not my goal. I don't want us to meet midway on common ground through student exchanges. And I don't believe that that mutual misunderstandings are a fundamental problem for our national interest and our national diplomacy, at least not put in terms of they ought to know more about us, we ought to know more about them. I mean, these strikes me as kind of things which are not outlandish thoughts, but they're not facts either. And I don't think that a conference held in another venue would necessarily take these things as easily as we tend to take them. I don't see the purpose of an academic conference as engaging in a common cause.
I'm Krista Tacey. I'm the Director of International Student Services at Texas A&M University and a former Foreign Service officer myself. I'm kind of coming in at a different perspective on this because I deal with about 5,000 international students who attend Texas A&M, and I also work very closely with our study abroad programs. And I think when we talk about exchanges, we're talking about what we see in the U.S. as J visitors who are on an exchange program, and we're talking about Fulbright and the prestigious programs that send our students abroad, but that makes about a tiny, tiny, tiny percent of the actual physical students who come here or students who go abroad from the United States. Out of my 5,000 international students, maybe 200 are on some sort of funded Fulbright exchange type of program. Out of the 2,000 or so domestic students from my institution who go on study abroad or some form of abroad program, maybe 10 are funded through some of these programs. So I think the real driver of the students coming here, anyway, I can speak to this very well, is economic. India, China, my graduate students, that's about 3/4 of my international student population, they come here to get a degree that they can take out and then get a job. What they care about is being on that F program so they can get optional practical training. They come study in the STEM fields so they can get a job in the United States. They study in the STEM fields so that they can get a job and work authorization for 29 months as opposed to 12 months. And so when Nick pointed out earlier, the president saying, oh, we don't want them going home. Well, our corporate America doesn't want them going home because they're less expensive than our domestic students, because our domestic students are a rarefied breed in the STEM fields right now. I'm looking at my numbers for today for my applicants to Texas A&M, and I have 14,000 international students applying for graduate admission to Texas A&M. I have less than 7,000 domestic students applying for a graduate program at Texas A&M. So what I'm looking at here is, when we're an engineering school, okay? So what I'm looking at is a lot of STEM fields and a lot of STEM majors. They come, they study, they work, and maybe they go home. But the first thing they do is try and find themselves an H-1B if they can find a sponsor. So when we talk about these exchanges, it's great, but we're talking a very, very, very small percent. So how do we reach the vast bulk of our international students who are here and take them a little bit out of that economic drive that keeps them here or brings them here and get them more involved in this whole taking a leadership role in their own country with a positive bent toward the U.S.
Great thoughts, Krista. Capabilities diplomacy. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Heinz Meyer. I'm a colleague of Dan Levy, and let me maybe also point a little bit in the opposite direction. I think I'm a little bit more of a do-gooder. Yes. I came in '83 from Germany on a Fulbright, and also stayed with some interruptions. One of my research interests is higher ed internationally and education internationally. And one episode, briefly recount after at the end of World War II, many of you know the United States established a re-education program in Germany, which entailed, getting rid of Nazis in influential positions and educating German teachers so that they would educate students in a democratic spirit. That program largely failed because it was basically, a top-down imposition by an occupational force. On the other hand, at the same time, or around the same time, the German Constitution was rewritten, or newly written, and lots of the participants were American trained and some, American consultants. And I venture to say that without the, intellectual experience represented by those people, Germany could not have gotten back on its feet in a democratic spirit. myself, coming here, I learned things that I never would have learned just from books if I had stayed in Germany. For example, the notion that, which I think Dan very much would agree with, that not everything that's for the public good needs to be organized by government. That's something you have to experience. You can't, it does not go as deep if you just read it in books. And people, I know many people who end up in, influential positions going back to their home country. They take these ideas and implement them. They influence the opinions they write on Supreme Court rulings and so forth in their home country. And that, to me, is invaluable. And I venture also very hard to measure in any kind of assessments, through surveys exit surveys as to when students leave. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more, and then I would like for our panelists to respond to a few of these comments. Yeah, sorry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carmen Duncan, and I'm a graduate student in the School of Social Welfare, and I most recently began to educate myself on international studies. This discussion today is very interesting to me because I was never interested with international studies. I just was very, domestic, want to stay here, want to work here, want to do, my whole social policy and public good thing here in the United States. But I believe that this is an important conversation that should be brought to the eyes and ears of minority students in urban high schools and college students in HEOP programs. In order to diversify the international arena and encourage young men and women who may not otherwise think of programs such as Fulbright. With that said, I have a question for everyone in the room, including the panel. As international professionals, how will you include students from minority backgrounds in the conversation of higher education and international programs?
Great question. Want to take a stab at it?
God.
I'm actually happy to take a stab at that unless you want to.
Sure, go ahead.
Just I have something very specific to say about that. I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say. I'll speak on behalf of SUNY. I work for SUNY System Administration, and that's actually a very clearly stated goal in our strategic plan. You saw, I can't remember anymore who it was who put up the metrics of the strategic plan, SUNY's goals in the international education arena. One of the goals that was not displayed, they weren't all up there, all of the metrics, but one of them is to get a larger number of underrepresented groups exposed to the opportunities of education abroad. The idea being, if you're bringing all sorts of underrepresented groups to college campuses, everyone ought to be able to avail themselves of the full experience, and education abroad is an important part of that full experience. To do so, one of the things we began last year, we had the first workshop on diversity in education abroad. We're working with a national organization called the Diversity Network. And their founder came, and we organized a workshop and brought study abroad and diversity professionals from SUNY campuses, financial aid folks, and talked about what are the barriers, because there are a lot of barriers. And we talked about how we may think we know what the barriers are, but those barriers may in fact be very different from the barriers that are apparent to us. So we, those of us who work directly with students, advising students on study abroad, need to learn about the possible barriers and how to make students comfortable in having a conversation about what destination might be right for me. Will there be someone there who has seen someone who looks like me before? Will there be some place that I can buy my hair products? Will I be able to get a replacement for my prosthetic limb if I have a problem with it? These sorts of issues that might cause serious barriers to students who want to study abroad may be perceived barriers, but not real barriers. So we need to be able, as professionals, to have those conversations. That and of course, providing the resources, the scholarship resources that are out there, because they are there. So.
Let me let our panel respond. One of my dear friends is Director of International Education at Spelman, actually in Georgia, and she runs into barriers of recruitment all the time along these lines you suggest. Please.
I'll start with, just very briefly. I think that our public education system is grossly underfunded. That is a position that I come from. I will state that. I think that we need more funding for our public education system in the United States. And I would argue that diplomacy is an exercise in compromise, but it is not a compromise on our core values. I do believe that we try to teach universal values to our students in human rights and international law, and we don't compromise on that. So just because we try to understand other cultures does not mean that we teach our students to compromise core values that are important to American and also global values in human rights and peace and justice. So I just want to emphasize that point.
Yeah, a couple of points. To at least one of the rhetorical questions, maybe this will be reassuring. Just because the argument that because the Chinese are doing these Confucius Institutes, we should do more, that argument doesn't work in Congress. I mean, it is maybe an expression of American exceptionalism, but I've never seen that resonate no matter what country you're talking about.
You can sell that argument to an American academic audience, but you can't sell it to Congress.
I guess not. I mean, it's another one that doesn't work is how many Fulbrighters you could get for the cost of one B-1 bomber. I mean, they're different subcommittees. It just doesn't wash. In terms of the Texas A&M comment about exchange volumes, if we call it all exchange for the purposes of discussion and shorthand, I agree completely. I mean, you've got the numbers of people who can come on funded exchange programs or who can study, Americans who can study critical languages through Title VI programs are really small if you consider the overall flows. And it's not just F1 students. There's a whole realm of J1 activities that beyond student and scholar, interns and trainees and au pairs and camp counselors and kids who come for summer jobs. And it's hard. We haven't, I think both the NGO sector and the government and university sector probably, depending on which people you have your hands on, haven't done a good enough job of measuring the impact of those experiences. And we believe in our bones that it does have a positive experience, and I think sponsors in some of these J1 categories do exit surveys, and the results are invariably very positive. But I don't think we've had the kind of in-depth research and independent research we really need. How we find the resources to do that, I can't tell you, but I think it's an important thing. On study abroad, one of the things, I didn't mention this when I talked about Simon, but one of the subtexts I picked up occasionally on the Hill was, and I don't think this was the deal breaker, but going back to Bob's initial point he made in his opening remarks about 70% of the kids who enter college say they're going to study abroad and then 2% do, so maybe they shouldn't go to college if they want to study abroad. It's pretty easy to find university presidents and university websites that talk about international engagement and having an international experience as a part of their mission now in this global world. And I think there are at least some staffers I talked to on the Hill who wondered if that were the case, why does it require, if that is what they have to do to perform their mission, why is additional federal funding the essential component in increasing study abroad numbers? I'm just telling you what I've heard. And then finally, on the minority student question, again, Rick can speak better to this than I, but I know that ECA, the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, and state has made enormous efforts to reach out to diversify the participation and the institutions that they connect with in terms of their awards. And the Gilman program in particular, you're familiar with Gilman? Named after Congressman Ben Gilman from New York State, who chaired the Senate International Relations Committee, I guess, when he was chairing it. It's a scholarship program for students who are Pell eligible. It's study abroad scholarships only for kids who are Pell eligible. It's administered by IIE, and their data is incredible in terms of minority participation and diversity, not just in the participants, but in the disciplines and the destinations. The only problem with the Gilman program is it doesn't have enough money.
John, you want to say a couple things, and then I'll...
Well, I was very interested to hear the remarks from Texas A&M. We have a similar situation on a smaller scale. We have a large engineering school and school management, and I believe the opportunity for students to have an extended OPT experience certainly has generated a lot of interest. Obviously, a lot of students are still keen on getting H-1Bs if they can, although interestingly, we've seen very few can at the present time. We noticed, I think more so is the case now than in the past, that students want to have a temporary work experience in the United States and then go back home because opportunities are better there. We're talking India and China. So it's a temporary stay. It's not an avenue necessarily to citizenship as it may once have been. This can be obviously a positive experience for these individuals in terms of their experience of the United States and in a work environment, not just higher education. And to further clarify about Confucius Institutes, I don't think Stephen's point was that we should imitate the Chinese. It was that we once upon a time had USIA, and we had information centers overseas, and we no longer do so. That's the point. Why don't we?
Let's take, one more.
I want to address Dan Levy's point. I think it's a very interesting question, and I appreciate your, cautionary note. We do kind of default into an advocacy position, and yet I sort of feel like, as I was thinking about it after you made your comment, I think I do feel a profound sense of responsibility to both to our students at a public land-grant university and to the taxpayers. And in a sense, what I see happening is we're defaulting into a whole series of international stances and positions sort of driven by financial necessity and sort of chaotic cascading budget cuts. And so we look at our major international partners are people who can essentially pay us to do things. So Sweden, Singapore, Qatar, Kazakhstan, China, and we're neglecting or pulling out of all those other very enormously needy, kind of fragile and weak states where we previously had partnerships. I also have a sense of responsibility to our students themselves. There was a discussion last spring as part of a proposal to split Madison off from the UW system, which was enormously controversial. But an important part of that was there was a faction pushing that who said we are obligated by state law to have 75% of our students at the flagship campus from the state of Wisconsin, and we would get out from under that rule. So we could go to 65, 60, 50%. And that 25% could, of course, be high-paying international students. The problem with sort of defaulting out of that, it's a tremendous disservice to the students of Wisconsin and the taxpayers who have built that infrastructure of the university for 150 years. But you also lose both intellectual breadth and diversity. It closes off equity for students who can't afford to go abroad on their own. It closes off the diversity of academic fields and of disciplines that are subsidized by federal investments. To maintain both equity for the students, for our students, and kind of the public responsibility that I feel to them, I do think that I personally feel it is appropriate for us to advocate for federal investments to maintain both intellectual breadth and breadth of programs and the equity issue.
We got time for one more. Let me let Bob offer final remarks.
Didn't mean to infer when I was commenting about what a small percentage of our students end up studying abroad, that I think that small percentage is a result of economics. I don't believe that. I've been at SUNY for 12 years now. I can't believe it, but I'm very happy because it means I'm still going after 12 years. I think there's something else in the culture that we need really to be concerned about, because I think that students seem to leave their homes and their high school experience with this idea in mind, and then something happens when they get to colleges and universities. And I don't mean only SUNY by any means, and I don't think it's the economics that are involved. I've counseled a large number of students, significant number, I think, of students who had no money but who figured it out, who went and figured it out because they wanted to do it so much. I think it's got more to do with the culture on the campus, with how they get distracted to other things when they're first leaving home. I don't think it's money.
I'm sorry, I promised Jason I would stay on time. So you've got a lot to talk about at lunch. But first, would you please give our panelists a round of applause?